Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Look, if you're a focused learner trying to make sense of the seemingly disconnected, absolute chaos in global politics right now, you are in the exact right place. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating, highly detailed geopolitical theory derived from our source documents called the Minimisation Plan. Now, the sources present this as a massive, multi-decade, multi-domain strategy run by a Sino-Russian axis. It's essentially an analysis that attempts to connect the dots between military conflicts, economic shifts, and even our own domestic political polarization, weaving them into one cohesive framework. It is a lot to unpack, but we're going to break it down step by step so you can see exactly how this theory argues the world is being reshaped.
Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. 1. The Minimization Plan. 2. Strategic Exhaustion. 3. The CRINK axis. 4. The resource drain. 5. The Delusionist vector. And finally, 6. A war of attrition.
All right, let's jump into part 1. 1. The Minimization Plan, a grand strategy.
So, to really understand this plan, we have to start with a central paradox. How exactly do you defeat a superpower without actually fighting it? I mean, a direct head-to-head military confrontation is way too risky in a nuclear age, right? Our sources suggest the answer is a sophisticated game of geopolitical jujitsu. It's this decentralized campaign literally designed to use the existing Western system's own weight and structure against itself.
Which brings us to Section 2. 2. Strategic Exhaustion, bleeding the system.
Okay, so the core operational method of this whole thing is strategic exhaustion. The objective isn't grabbing land, it's bleeding the opponent dry. By spinning up multiple crises all over the map, the Axis forces the US and its allies into a reactive, perpetually high-cost military posture. For example, our sources point out that proxy conflicts in Ukraine and tensions involving Iran actually serve a remarkably similar function in this plan. They act as massive sinkholes, specifically designed to drain the West of resources like missiles and bullets. It's wild. It effectively turns Allied defenses into a wildly expensive skeet shoot where multi-million-dollar Patriot systems are forced to knock down cheap throwaway Iranian drones. And meanwhile, the sources argue, European allies won't lift a finger to help, especially regarding Trump and Iran. This intentionally accelerates the drain on American stockpiles, pushing the West right to the brink of an unsustainable imperial overstretch.
Let's move to Section 3. 3. The CNCR axis nodes of the network.
So who is actually executing this? The sources identify the operating group as the CRILK alliance. But keep in mind, this isn't a traditional top-down military structure. It is a decentralized ecosystem. China acts as the minimizer director, using its massive economic weight as a shield. Russia is the battering ram, out there absorbing Western military resources in Europe. Iran brings the asymmetric specialty with those low-cost drones. And North Korea, they're basically a giant munitions depot and secondary provocateur. And this network has deep roots. The sources trace this proto-CRILK axis back to 1993. On March 12th of that year, North Korea announced it was withdrawing from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, basically getting the okay for its nukes because it knew China had its back. Then in July 93, you had China's Yinhai incident, where chemicals bound for Iran prompted an international standoff. This was huge. It formed a clarion call to the world, essentially saying, hey, if you hate the USA, ally with us, because so do we, and we're scrappy enough to stand up to them. With the chemicals bound for Iran, they were directly invited in, proving China can shield them. Boom, alliances ensued. By October 11, 1993, Russian and Chinese defense ministries officially approved military cooperation. And just like that, the proto-axis was formed. It's a brilliant division of labor for a very long war of attrition.
Section 4. 4. The resource drain, the kinetic cost.
Just look at this number, $43 billion. That staggering amount is what the U.S. Congress authorized just for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative between 2022 and 2025 alone. The sources emphasize that this massive financial commitment is a direct physical reaction to calibrated military pressure and posturing from the Sino-Russian axis out in the Indo-Pacific.
And this right here perfectly illustrates that asymmetric return on investment. Look, for the relatively low cost of running some joint military exercises, basically, paying for fuel and daily ops, the Axis forces the West to commit to multi-billion-dollar procurement cycles. The analysis highlights that over $53 billion has been committed regarding Taiwan recently, and that AUKUS submarine pact for Australia, that's projected to cost up to $368 billion over 30 years. So the Axis provokes the threat, and the West willingly bleeds its own economic resources to build a wall against it.
All right, Section 5. 5. The delusionist vector, the internal drain.
Now we shift from the external drain to the internal drain, and the sources present a really fascinating theory here regarding domestic politics, specifically looking at Donald Trump as what they call a delusionist vector. Looking at this impartially just to understand the source's framework, they argue that a figure like him was actually inevitable. Why? Because China needed a guy on the inside. They trace a 4-decade timeline, starting with Soviet trips in the 80s and deep capital dependency on Russian liquidity in the 90s. The analysis likens this to a massive, long-term social engineering hack. It's exactly like cracking someone's password, but instead of guessing it, you spend 32+ years using economic dependency and media domination to just convince the public that the absolute best password is 12345. They voluntarily set it to what the Axis wanted. It wasn't about stealing secrets, it was about establishing a dependency that weakens the system's immune system, paving the way for a proposed peace offensive in 2025 that effectively locks in authoritarian territorial gains.
Now, what's really crucial here is how the text frames this relationship. The source explicitly states he is not a Russian spy in the traditional sense. Instead, they label him a will vector. The theory posits that his personal instincts, his highly transactional nature, and his aggressive pushback against multilateral alliances just naturally perfectly align with the strategic goals of Russia and the PRC. The vector of his actions organically serves the exact objectives of the Minimization Plan.
Check out this quote. The analysis describes his function as transferring administrative privileges away from democratic institutions and handing them to a transnational oligarchy. The sources argue this internal vector uses inversion rhetoric, basically flipping the script so the free press is positioned as the enemy, while autocratic adversaries are praised as strong. This rhetoric is designed to validate authoritarianism, essentially rotting away the domestic cohesion and institutional trust the West desperately needs to counter those external threats. It's an internal drain that drastically amplifies the external pressure. Which brings us to our final section. 6. A war of attrition, the two fronts.
This right here is the dark genius of the Minimization Plan, the interplay between kinetic attrition and cognitive attrition. You've got the external bleeding of physical resources, missiles, bullets, capital, out in places like Ukraine and the Pacific. That puts immense strain on Western budgets. And then, that strain directly empowers the internal political chaos and polarization at home, the cognitive attrition, which in turn makes it even harder for the West to mount a unified, coherent response to the physical threats. It is just a brutal, self-reinforcing cycle of exhaustion.
So, to summarize the core thesis of this explainer, the Minimization Plan isn't trying to build some competing better world order right now. The goal is much simpler and honestly far more destructive. The goal is to shatter the existing domestic and international order. Period. By physically, economically, and psychologically exhausting the West, the Axis simply aims to create a massive global power vacuum, a void where a new, multipolar reality, one that is highly favorable to authoritarian rule, can just comfortably slide right in. I want to leave you with this final, genuinely provocative thought. The analysis points out a really uncomfortable truth: the very strengths of a free society, our open markets, our free press, our sprawling global alliances, are the exact same vectors being weaponized against us by this rhizomatic threat. So, if our own democratic openness is being used to induce this strategic exhaustion, how on earth do we defend the system without closing off and abandoning the very values that define who we are? It's a massive, complex puzzle for sure. But understanding the Minimization Plan, that is the absolutely critical first step to solving it.
Thanks so much for learning with me today.